All right. So it looks like it's about that time for us to get started. Feel free to keep chiming in on the question, have more discussion if you want. I'll also be keeping an eye on chat and QA throughout it. So if you do have a question, the best way is going to be to ask it in the QA panel, and then I'll see it immediately coming up. I'm sure everyone's experts at this by now since it's the last session of the day. But thank you for coming. My name is Lucas Mott. Today I'm going to talk about open source and how you can join the movement. So with this talk, I want to specifically cover, do you want a way that you can build your professional portfolio, gain new skills, create connections, help your resume stand out, contribute to something bigger than yourself, and potentially make a worldwide impact? If those sound appealing to you, look no further than open source. It's a way to do all the things we just talked about. And we will define what open source is and how you can get started and contribute and all that good stuff. But first, I think it's always helpful to start with, who am I? So I am a software engineer at Atlassian. I have about 10 years of experience in the field. If you're not familiar with it, Atlassian it is a company that makes software for other tech companies. If you get a job in software engineering, they make a tool called Jira that you'll probably see pretty soon into your career. I'm also a huge fan of open source. I've contributed to multiple different projects. I have open source projects myself, and I've contributed to one project with over 27,000 stars, which is a direct reference to GitHub. There was a GitHub session earlier this day. Everyone may not have had the chance to attend, but basically a star is whenever a developer or a user on GitHub says this project is useful and they click a button to like it. I'm an Evansville native. I've been in Evansville all my life. That's in southern Indiana, for anyone who's not sure, right across the river from Kentucky. And I'm a University of Southern Indiana alum. I went there for computer science. I also consider myself to be a maker, and I mention this specifically because I've included two images of, on the left is a computer I built using a Raspberry Pi. That's a complete contained unit that's waterproof. And on the right is an enclosure I built for my 3D printer. I mention this specifically because there's a large overlap between open source and the maker community, and even the hacker community to a degree. And not the hacker community, hoodie on keyboards hackers, but the hackers of people that are trying to do good by making software work for them in different ways. I also wanted to mention that this talk also uses a book for a lot of its information. It's called How to Open Source by Richard Sheeman. I've worked with him before at a previous job. He's a much larger contributor to open source than I am. He's a core contributor to the Ruby language, and he's a top contributor to Ruby on Rails, including being maintainers for other languages. He's done a lot. He has great information, specific steps and details on how you can get started, how you can start contributing code, how you can do so even if you don't know how to program. And if you're interested, I've included an email down there at the bottom. Feel free to shoot me an email. I have his permission to hand out this book for free as a PDF. I'll include this email at the end of it as well. This came out after I'd already chosen this topic for the conference, so it was really good timing. So we can go ahead and start with some definitions. That's the first thing we need to talk about, because what is open source? And I've included the formal definition there on the first bullet, basically saying open source is source code that's available for the general public. And what does that mean? It means that open source is a series of programs, just pure code, apps, basically anything you use with technology. If you write code for something to accomplish a task and then make it free for people to use, that is open source. It's characterized by the fact that it's free and that it can be worked on by a community of people. It started with the dawn, open source as we know it started with the dawn of the modern internet, with apps, websites, all that sorts of things. But it's been around much longer. It's had a very long history, and it helped create the internet as we know it today. Because of that, it also runs much of the internet as we know today. I think the last time I saw a statistic, it was over 90% of the internet as we know it, which includes websites, apps, basically everything your phone does, and video games runs off of something that is either an open source project now or is built off of an open source project. One of the most well-known pieces of open source software is Linux. It's Linux was released as free and open source in 1991, and it's attracted a huge gathering of developers and enthusiasts that all work together to try and make it as strong as possible. And because of that, it's also attracted a lot of languages and programs and things that run specifically on it, which is why it's so ubiquitous across the internet today. Open source specifically did start in the 50s and 60s. It was primarily an academic venture. The people who worked at universities, when they were first trying to figure out how we can make these things called computers useful, made all their research and shared them together. So why is open source important? Why are we talking about it today? And like I said, it runs almost every piece of technology that we have, or it served as the base for it. This includes phones, routers, laptops, most modern cars, even your fridge probably has either it directly uses open source or it has a base in open source as well. And a large majority of web apps, websites, and online services are powered by open source. This includes basically if you go to the App Store and look at the top 10 apps, it's probably going to have some kind of open source running it in the background. There's TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, Snapchat. All of them use web languages and frameworks and things that you can go and start building with yourself right now. And that's one of the major appeals of open source is it provides a platform for you to start a business, for you to take your idea and build an application to do something, to create something cool that people can use. And you can do it without software licensing cost. And software licensing costs are whenever you have to pay to use a piece of software or to run it on a particular computer. So for it as an example, Microsoft makes Windows. Windows is a licensed piece of software. It is closed. You cannot look at the code that makes Windows, and you have to pay to use it. They make programming languages. They make servers that run applications and run phone apps, but you have to pay just to use them in addition to paying to run them on the computers they run on. Another example is Mac and iPhone. Both Mac and iPhone are actually built directly off of open source systems, but they've been added onto and changed, and Apple now sells them on their own as Mac OS and iOS. So why should you contribute to open source? Well, I've talked a lot about what it is, but what would benefit you? And the first bullet is not directly benefiting you, but it's keeping the practice alive. Open source is extremely important. As I said before, it's built much of the internet and the technological world as we know it. So it keeping the practice alive of making this open, keeping it accessible to new people is extremely important. It requires new people coming in all the time. It'll also help keep technology as we know it open and free. If you can go in and start something with a free language or build something with a free tool, it makes it so that anyone, anywhere can take their idea and do something with it. You can also be part of something larger than yourself. There's a chance that if you contribute code to an open source repository, it could be used by, no kidding, thousands, millions of developers as they make other products. Every programming language, you may have heard of Python, JavaScript, Ruby, they all are open source projects. They all take contributions from developers. And if you can get your code in one of these projects, there's a chance that millions of developers might use it. It can also offer a unique challenge to build your skills because there's an open source project for almost anything you can think of. There are open source projects for gaming, most Minecraft mods, the Minecraft ecosystem outside of the game itself is built on open source tools and a community that works together to make them better. So if you are interested in gaming, if you're interested in building a website, building apps, there's an open source project you can use to make yourself better and work with some of the top developers in the world without having to join a big tech company. It can also help build a resume for any stage in your career. I personally have 10 years of experience at this point. I'm still putting my open source contributions on my resume. It shows that I know languages I may not work in every day. It shows that I am able to work with people and communicate. And if you're just starting out in tech, one of the main things that companies will look for is, do you have something on your resume that shows you know how to do your job. And open source can be that first part, that first key to get you into a job. And the other thing that's nice is open source is open. So you don't have to submit code. You can put a single line on your resume, say, this is my profile on GitHub on a hosting platform, and they can go there and see all the code you've written, all the code you've contributed, and you don't have to do any additional work. So how can you contribute? If you want to get started, if all this sounds good, how do you get going? So the first place is to know where open source lives. The number one place that you could probably find an open source project is a website called GitHub. There's actually a session earlier today that talked about GitHub and went into more depth. And if you were there, great. If you weren't, not a problem. We'll cover it more as well. GitHub and also GitLab. GitLab is very similar to GitHub. They do essentially the same thing. It's just another name. They are they are places to host what are called code repositories. So it's essentially a folder of all your code that you put on the internet somewhere that people can look at. And GitHub is where a lot of the open source community lives and thrives, because that gives them the tools to work together and collaborate. You can also find, especially larger open source projects, they may host them themselves. A lot of times projects like that will have their own website. They'll have instructions about how you can get access, things like that. But if you can't find something on GitHub, you'll almost always be able to find a website for the project. Some older open source projects like Linux actually still use email list for all communications. The code is hosted separately, and they communicate through emails to make every major decision. And all the emails are in the open, so you can actually get out there and read them. But I'll focus on GitHub for this because that's the majority of where you'll find open source projects these days. And the other thing that's tough about open source is, how do you find a project to contribute to? Where do you get started? And the best two tips that I have are: find a project that does something you enjoy. So something you would like to work with, something you want to learn more about, or find something with a cause you want to support. The more internal motivation you have and the more connection you feel to this community that's building software, the better you'll be able to contribute and take your time to do so. So I included a link here. This is a open source project called Nightscout. Nightscout is really cool. It is a open source blood glucose monitoring software. It's used by a lot of parents. If they don't want to pay to have to see this information, you can actually use this, especially for children, to monitor blood glucose levels. I've had coworkers that have used this. I've used to work at a company called Heroku, where a large part of our free platform was used to host this software. And this entire website talks about how to use it, how to contribute, how to configure it, how to host it for free. And it's not extremely technically complicated, but it does appeal to people who want to contribute to this cause. A more personal example, and something a bit more technical, this is a pull request that what's called a pull request. So I went in and requested my code be added to a project. This is for a project called TinyGo, which is a way to use a programming language called Go on computers, microcontrollers specifically. So ways to control motors, make little robots, do very low-level software work using the Go language that I'm a big fan of. And I noticed that there was a display that I really liked that was round that they didn't have the ability to use. So I went in and I opened up the pull request that basically I wrote the code. So you can go in here and you can see the actual code that I wrote. This is all code that I wrote so that people could come and use this display just like I wanted to be able to do. And then I put it up and I said, this is what it does. This is what I'd like to accomplish. Can you look at the code? And I actually had a great conversation with the founders of the project, talking back and forth, seeing some changes they wanted to see. I learned a few things, and then my pull request was submitted and cloned into the repository. Basically saying my code now lives in this project, and if you pull it down right now, you could use my code to run this little display, which looks like this. And this is all it is. This is all I wanted to do. It's for a project I'm building to make a radar-like system, but I really wanted to use this display. I wanted to use Go, and I had the chance to work this, build the driver, and get my code added in and support this project that I enjoy all at the same time. So how do you start? Right? It's a bit easier for me. I've been doing software. I know how to program. I have an idea of what's out there. But if you don't know how to program, if you're new to this, what's a good place to start? And the best place is to gather context. So on GitHub, this is the repository for the project I was just speaking of. It's called TinyGo. And whenever you first open up the GitHub page for the repository, or repository again being the folder the code is kept in, you can see they have all the links for the files here that make up the project. They have something called a README that says if you want to use, install, configure this software, this is how you use it. And then they also have contributing guidelines saying if you want to contribute to this project, how do you do it? And this is all the ways they say these are the ways you can help us the most with contributing. The large majority of open source projects are just done by people in their free time. So the better that you can align with the contributing guidelines, the more likely it'll make it that you can help out and contribute. The two most important pages for helping with open source and contributing your code are issues and pull requests. Issues are anytime someone's using this code and they find a problem, they can open up an issue to tell the maintainers, hey, I've seen this problem. Is there anything that you can do to help? So this repository has 346 issues, which is a lot. They probably need some help. It was all done in their spare time. But you can go through, and some of them are really old. And these are all people who are using this software who have had issues that would either like them to be fixed or they just wanted to bring it up. And then this is pull request. So pull request is, as I mentioned before, a way to say, I have this code and I want to add it to your code. So these are people that are fixing a bug from the issues page, adding a new feature like I did, maybe even just updating documentation. But for one reason or another, these are all the ones that are open that haven't been merged yet for some reason. So they're either waiting to finish something, they are waiting, or they need to fix something. There are lots of reasons. I do see a question. It says, what if I'm making a web page that has formulas I don't want known to the public, but I'd still like to include the file in the repository? That's more of a technical question. You can use a file called it's called a .gitignore. So that will keep anything you don't want in the public from ending up in your Git repository. I think basically every single Git repository you'll see will have one. So it's this .gitignore file. In this case, it's just information. It's just things that would clutter it up that they don't want to be included in. So I mentioned before, one of the best ways to start is to gather context. So that repository we just saw has 300 bugs. How can you help with that, especially if you don't know how to program or you're not familiar with the code? And one of the best ways to do is just to look through and see what's going on and gather context. So what kind of help do they need? That repository we just saw could probably use some help working through their bugs. They have a lot of them. So can you go in? Can you help answer a question? Can you see if a bug is still relevant? And then you can also look at what PRs have been recently merged, what pull requests have been merged. So what kind of code are they adding to this? Is this something I can help with by adding a new feature? The most important thing is just the philosophy of floss one tooth. The hardest step is just getting started. It's taking the first step. So start with something small and manageable. Leave a comment, ask a question, follow up on something. And once you start, it's a lot easier to continue. Most open source maintainers do it in their free time. They have a lot of work to do. They're almost always behind on where they wish they could be. So if you're able to offer help in a meaningful way, they will almost always appreciate it. Some starting actions that you can do to get involved, even if you don't know how to program. So first is, can you confirm a bug that someone reported is still there? Sometimes people will put bugs up and the bug will sit there for a while. And then there's a fix that's released and that person never gets around to saying, oh, this bug was closed. So can you go in, see if the bug is still there, and then even just ask, hey, you opened this a year ago. Are you still seeing this problem? By you doing that, you're helping the maintainer not have to do it. And if they come back and say, yes, this is done, then you can directly ask the maintainer, I think we can close this. And it takes one number away from that 300 issues that you could see on a repository. Another part is reproducing the bug. So can you go in and, using the information in this bug report, get it to do the same thing? If not, is there any way you can make it more explicit, make it easier for someone who has the knowledge to fix it to reproduce it? Reproducing a bug is the first step to fixing it, because you have to find out how something is failing before you can fix it. I included this as an example. This would be what I'd say is about a medium example of what's gone wrong and what's producing it for a issue. Basically saying they want to use this accelerometer with this certain board, it's not working. Well, this is good, but there aren't step-by-step instructions. If I was coming to this brand new, it would save me a lot of time if there were steps that would say, use this program, load this code, do these exact steps, and then it will help me solve the problem. Another thing is issue triaging, which is essentially if you go into an open source project and they have a lot of issues, like the one we keep looking at, can you help? Can you try and close old ones? Can you ask clarifying questions? Can you move things along without the maintainers having to get involved? Because there are other things that they're probably up to with their project. And then documentation updates are always welcome. If you use a piece of software, let's say you're making a Minecraft mod and you add it to your world, do the steps to adding that mod to your world make sense? Can you follow them one after the other? Do the tools all work on your computer? If they don't, is there something you had to do to get them working? Is everything grammatically correct? By updating documentation, you not only make it easier for others to use it, but you can stop issues from coming in and cluttering up the issues board that have already been answered in the documentation, or that require a very easy fix. Some advanced actions that you can take once you're familiar with the repository, maybe once you've done some programming, once you have a bit more ground under your feet, you can start closing bugs. It's hard to judge how difficult a bug is to fix, so the best thing to do is just getting started. There's no such thing as a perfect starter issue. Some repositories will label that they have starter issues you can start with, but it's still very subjective. So the best thing to do is just to dive in, find something you think you could handle, and start working on it. If you make progress, communicate about it. Say, hey, I've started on this issue. I've made some progress. I'm going to keep working away at it until I hopefully fix it. And as long as you communicate your updates on that issue, then people will be able to follow along. It will especially help not duplicate work. Once you learn even more, you can start looking at adding features, similar to what I did to add that display. Whenever I first started using TinyGo, I wanted to use it for the board. The board I wanted to use it for was supported, which was great, but I didn't have any way to use this display I needed for my project because I specifically wanted a round display. So I went in, I looked at some bugs, I looked at other pull requests that had been merged, and I gathered enough context to know that if I submit my pull request, I make sure to check these boxes, then there's a good chance it will get merged as well. And they were very appreciative of it, which was nice. And you can also finish a feature request that someone else has put in. A lot of times life happens, people can't finish what they started. So if you can go in and finish someone else's work, it's also very helpful. The last most advanced thing you can do is offer feedback on proposed features. Sometimes people will open an issue and the issue is saying, we would like to see this added. And once you have a lot of contacts, you can say, this works, this is a good idea. Or you can say, this wouldn't work, this isn't a good idea, and propose a different way to go about and handle it. This is the most complex one, but after you've been working with something for a while, it's some of the most valuable feedback you can give and help with maintainers. So in summary, open source is all around us. It powers the internet as we know it. It powers apps, it powers your phones. It creates a way for people to start businesses and get their ideas to other people. And everything was built by volunteers. You can keep it running. We need new contributors that are always willing to jump in and help with open source. It's similar to running a business. people leave, new people join for this reason or for that reason. So you need new people that are willing to come on and help. It can also help build a resume. Like I mentioned before, it's still on my resume. If I will usually just include a link to my GitHub, and my GitHub shows my top repositories, the ones I've committed, the ones I've helped with, the ones that I host, and recruiters can go here and see, oh, he's doing things outside of work that not only maybe are skills we want in this company, but shows that he's doing good things with his spare time. And it can also help build your skills. I learned a lot with the pull request that I used as an example here. I've not done much low-level programming, so it was a lot of good information about what they're looking for, things that I had missed, and things that I can take with me to help in my career. At the bottom, I've gone ahead and I've included that email as well. Feel free to write it down. If you'd like a copy of the open source book I mentioned earlier, which will give more concrete actions and steps you can take to get started, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send back the PDF for you to read. But that's all I had. Thank you all for joining. I really hope that some of you may want to join open source after this point. It's very nebulous. There's not a single open source council. It's just finding something you like, something that you appreciate, and trying to help out. And then I'll feel free to start asking questions. I'll look at the chat and then I'll see what questions. So have you ever started, hosted, maintained an open source project? And yes, I have. So we'll go back to my GitHub. Like I said, GitHub is primarily the place where open source lives. And I have one main project that I've hosted and created and run, and it's called Meshtastic Go. So Meshtastic is a cool thing that I found that it works on radios that lets you send messages, basically text messages, from miles away with just these tiny radios. It uses a protocol called LoRa, and I loved it. I thought it was super interesting. But as I was using the radios, I noticed that I wanted to be able to communicate with the radios and configure them and set them up on a Raspberry Pi, and they didn't have any good tools to do that. I'm a big fan of the Go language because it lets you create programs that can run on essentially any operating system, any computer. So I went in and I made my own tool that I can use to program these radios without having to use the tools that they had and run into some of the hurdles. So this one is a tool that you can configure radios and run it on basically essentially any computer you'd want. I don't think there are any that I've run into I haven't been able to run this on. And because that was my intention, I actually include all this programs here that you can run. You can download these and run them on your computer to talk to these little radios. I've had people contribute to this as well, so it's not just me. I think I've had 3 people total come in and help. I've had people fix typos. I've had people come in and remove code, redundant code. I've had people add in some extra testing, and it's been very useful because this is the project I do in my spare time, and I have other hobbies as well. So when someone can come in and make my code easier to read by even just going in and removing lines of code that I don't need, it's fantastic. I was extremely happy whenever I saw this. Are there any other questions? Anything else I can answer? Also, feel free to ask any questions about like how you can use it to help you get into tech, anything like that. I'm more than happy to speak on.